When I opened that old wooden chest, the smell of dust and lavender hit me first, like time itself had been sealed inside. And there it was, a silver locket I'd never seen before, nestled between yellowed lace and faded letters. It shouldn't have meant anything to me, but the moment I touched it, I felt something, an ache deep in my chest, like a memory I didn't own was trying to surface. That locket changed everything. It unraveled a story I didn't even know I was part of, and it made me question everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mother, and about myself. Before all that, life was quiet, predictable even. I lived in the same small town where I'd grown up, Maple Creek, where the scent of pine and rain lingers long after a storm, and everyone still knows which house used to belong to the Petersons. After my mother passed, I inherited the old family home, a creaking two-story thing with peeling paint, sagging gutters, and a porch that moaned louder than my knees when the weather turned cold. I told myself I'd fix it up one day, but truthfully, it was easier to leave most things untouched. Like I was keeping her alive through the clutter she left behind. Every Sunday, I'd brew her favorite tea, chamomile with honey and a squeeze of lemon, and sit by the window where she used to read. The radio would hum softly in the background, and I'd listen to the same station she loved, the one that still played Frank Sinatra and old gospel songs. That was my normal. A rhythm built on small routines and unspoken grief. My mother, Evelyn, had always been a woman of grace, soft-spoken, deliberate, but guarded. She loved deeply, but revealed little. She'd been gone for almost a year when my cousin Marjorie called about the estate auction. "They're clearing out Uncle Walter's place," she said. "You should come by. He might have had things your mama left behind." Uncle Walter was my mother's older brother, a quiet man, a veteran, who lived alone after his wife passed. We weren't close. Our family wasn't the type to gather often, but respect kept the ties intact. So, that Saturday, I drove over. The sky hung gray and heavy, the air thick with that damp chill before rain. The house was half empty, boxes stacked in corners, furniture tagged with little stickers. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, remembering holidays when the same halls were filled with laughter and roasted turkey and the sound of Walter's record player spinning. That's when I saw the chest, wedged beneath an old dresser, half hidden under a moth-eaten quilt. The chest was small, cedar, with brass hinges and a faint carving of initials, E.M.C. My mother's initials before she married my father. I remember crouching down, brushing the dust off the lid, tracing the letters with my thumb. "You taken that?" Marjorie asked. "I think I should," I said quietly. It was hers. Back home, I placed a chest on the kitchen table. The late afternoon sun fell across it in slanted stripes, catching the dull shine of the brass. I hesitated before opening it. Funny how an object can hold power just by existing. When I finally lifted the lid, the scent hit me first, lavender, and something older, something faintly metallic, like the smell of time gone stale. Inside were a few small things: an embroidered handkerchief, some sepia photographs, a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, and that locket. The locket was oval, silver, delicate, but tarnished. A small engraving on the back read, "To E, my heart always." I turned it over in my hand, tried to open it, but the clasp was stuck. The letters, I noticed, were addressed to my mother, but not from anyone I recognized. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost old-fashioned. The return name read only R.H. That's when the unease began. My mother had never spoken of anyone with those initials. I should have stopped there, closed the chest, left it all to memory. But curiosity, that quiet, dangerous thing, it doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it hums just loud enough to drown out reason. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Rain had begun to fall, steady and rhythmic against the glass. I untied the blue ribbon around the letters. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something like reverence. The first letter was dated June 1959. My mother would have been just 19 then. My dearest Evelyn, I watched you walk away today, and the world felt smaller. I know we cannot be what we were, not here, not now. But please remember that my silence is not forgetfulness. It is duty. I carry you in every breath. There was no signature beyond the initials, just RH. The rest of the letters were much the same, short, tender, and aching. There was love there, love hidden behind restraint and circumstance. I sat there for hours reading every one, and with each word, I realized I had no idea who my mother had been before me. The next morning, I took the locket to a jeweler in town, hoping he could pry it open without breaking it. He wore glasses that slipped down his nose every several seconds and handled the locket like it was glass. "Beautiful piece," he murmured. "Early 60s craftsmanship, maybe. Older. These hinges, very fine work." When it finally clicked open, I felt my breath catch. Inside were 2 photographs. One of my mother, younger, hair in soft curls, smiling shyly. And beside her, a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark hair, military uniform. "Could be her husband?" the jeweler asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, my father never wore a uniform." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, a question in his eyes. But I didn't answer. I just closed the locket and slipped it into my pocket. As I walked out of the shop, the bell over the door jingled lightly, the sound almost mocking. Because in that moment, I realized something simple but devastating. Whatever my mother had kept locked away all those years, it wasn't just love. It was a secret that might change everything I thought I knew about where I came from. That night, I sat again with the chest, letters spread out like pieces of a puzzle. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, the pipes moaned softly, like even the walls remembered. And for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own family story.
I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face from the locket, calm, serious, proud. The way he looked at my mother in that tiny photograph, it wasn't the kind of gaze that belonged to a passing acquaintance. By dawn, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a friend, maybe a relative. But a part of me, that small intuitive part that sounds like your mother even after she's gone, whispered that I already knew better. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the letters stacked neatly beside my mug. Outside, the world was waking up. Birds singing, a dog barking in the distance, the hum of a neighbor's lawnmower starting too early. Life went on, unaware that mine had tilted ever so slightly off balance. I decided I wouldn't tell anyone yet. Not Marjorie, not my brother Paul. Especially not Paul. He had a way of brushing off anything that didn't fit neatly into his version of the world. Mom was private, he'd say. Let her rest. But I couldn't. Something about those letters. It wasn't just romance. There was a sense of urgency, a tone of farewell running beneath every word. Over the next week, I tried to live normally. I went to work, cooked dinner, tended the little garden by the porch. But my mind kept circling back to the locket, to the initials RH, to the photo that didn't fit into any of my family's albums. One evening, while sorting through the attic for old documents, I found a small metal box tucked behind a stack of yearbooks. Inside were birth certificates, property deeds, and a single envelope marked Private EM. The handwriting was my mother's. The paper inside was thin and worn from years of folding. It wasn't a letter. It was a birth certificate. Mine. But there was something odd. The father's name was blank. I froze. I must have read it a dozen times, tracing the empty space as if letters might appear if I stared hard enough. I remembered my father, Thomas Cole. Quiet, dependable, the kind of man who always polished his shoes and never raised his voice. He'd passed away when I was 15. I'd never thought to question him or his marriage to my mother. But if this certificate was real, and it was with its official seal, then what did that mean? Why wasn't his name there? That question gnawed at me for days. I even pulled out my parents' wedding photo from the living room shelf. My mother stood in lace, radiant but oddly composed, while my father smiled as if he was trying to believe in something. The date written on the back caught my eye. May 1962. I was born in March 1963. The timing made sense, but the blank space on that certificate still whispered doubt. Was there something that happened between those years that my mother never spoke of? A few days later, I visited Paul. He and his wife lived just outside of town, in a newer house with open floors and white walls that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. He was in the backyard grilling when I arrived. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, stranger, finally decided to leave that museum you call a house?" I laughed, but my mind wasn't on small talk. We ate dinner, steak, corn on the cob, salad, the kind of meal that makes conversation easy. When his wife stepped inside to grab dessert, I finally asked, "Paul, did Mom ever mention someone named RH?" He frowned, chewing slowly. "RH? No, why?" "I found some letters. They were in her old chest. Love letters, I think." He looked uncomfortable, like I'd said something indecent. "You shouldn't read those, Lila. Mom had her reasons for keeping things private." "I know, but—" I hesitated. "There's a picture. A man. He's not Dad." Paul sighed, setting down his fork. "Lila, she was young once. People have pasts. You can't go digging into them now." "But what if that past changes everything we thought we knew?" His expression hardened. "You're overthinking it, Lila. Mom loved Dad. That's what matters." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was afraid that if I found something real, something undeniable, it might shake the foundation of our family story. I didn't push. I just nodded, finished my meal, and drove home in silence. The next morning, I called the county records office. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for birth and military records for someone possibly stationed near Maple Creek in the late 1950s. His initials are RH." The clerk sighed. "Ma'am, that's pretty broad. We'd need a full name." I thanked her and hung up, feeling foolish. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I went back to the letters, hoping one might contain a clue. And there it was, in one of the later ones, a line that nearly made my heart stop. "They've sent me back to Fort Ridley. The uniform feels heavier each time I wear it. But knowing you wait, Evelyn, that is the only thing that keeps me steady." Fort Ridley. The base had closed years ago, but it wasn't far, just 2 towns over. My father had never been in the military. Neither had Uncle Walter. The only person that connection belonged to was him. That weekend, I drove out to where Fort Ridley used to stand. The road was cracked and overgrown, the old barracks reduced to shells of concrete and rusted fencing. But near the entrance, A small community museum had been built, dedicated to the soldiers who'd served there. An elderly volunteer greeted me with a kind smile. "Can I help you, miss?" "I'm looking for someone who served here in the late 50s. Initials RH. He nodded thoughtfully. "Let's take a look." He led me to a wall of black and white photos, rows upon rows of young men in uniform. My eyes scanned the faces until one made my breath catch. It was him, the man from the locket. Beneath the photo, a small plaque read, "Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 1935 to 1963. I felt the ground shift beneath me. 1963, the year I was born. As I stood there, the volunteer said softly, "He died young. Plane crash, I believe. Left behind a fiancée, they said." A fiancée. I didn't have to ask her name. The truth was starting to take shape. Fragile, but undeniable. My mother's first love hadn't just been a secret. He had been my beginning.
I drove home from Fort Ridley in silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of the tires on old asphalt and the low hum of wind sneaking through the window cracks. The name echoed in my mind. Robert Hayes. It sounded too familiar and too foreign all at once. I whispered it under my breath, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Robert Hayes. My mother's R.H. I pulled into the driveway just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The old house looked different that evening. Heavier somehow, as if the weight of the truth I'd found had settled into its walls. Inside, I placed the locket on the kitchen table and sat across from it. The silver caught the light from the window, gleaming faintly even through the tarnish. If Robert Hayes died in 1963, and I was born that same year, I didn't need to finish the sentence. My heart had already done the math. I found myself reaching for the letters again, rereading them under the soft glow of the lamp. There were 17 in total, each one a piece of a love that was never meant to survive. The last letter was dated February 1963, just 1 month before I was born. My dearest Evelyn, they're moving me again. I don't know if I'll make it home this time. I've sent the ring, as promised. If things go as planned, I'll return by spring. Hold on to faith for us. Whatever happens, know that my love has already taken root in you and in what we've created together. The words blurred before my eyes. I had to read that last line over and over. In what we've created together. Tears came before I realized I was crying. I pressed a trembling hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the sob that broke free. He wasn't just her lover. He was my father. I don't know how long I sat there, letting the truth settle like dust around me. At some point, I must have drifted into sleep at the kitchen table because I woke to the sound of birds and the faint light of morning creeping in through the blinds. My face was tight from dried tears. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hand shaking as I reached for my phone. My instinct was to call Paul, to tell him everything. But the moment I imagined his face, the judgment, the denial, I stopped. No, he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't visited my mother's grave in weeks. It was a small plot near the back, shaded by oak trees that dropped acorns like soft rain. Her name was carved simply, Evelyn M. Cole, 1940 to 1923. Below it, the words she had chosen herself, "Peace is knowing you have loved well." I knelt there, brushing away the fallen leaves. Why didn't you tell me, Mama? Why did you let me live my whole life believing a lie? The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses against your ribs until you feel it physically. I thought about my father, Thomas Cole, the man who had raised me, taught me to ride a bike,
held my hand when I was scared of thunder. He must have known. He had to know. And yet he never said a word. That afternoon, I went back to the house and pulled out a box from the attic labeled Dad's Things. Inside were old photographs, a pocket watch, and a stack of letters tied with twine. I hesitated before opening them. My chest tightened as if my body already knew what my mind was about to learn. The first few letters were from my mother to my father. Ordinary, warm, full of everyday life. But near the bottom, one letter stood out. It was dated July 1963. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, but the tone, it was apologetic. Thomas, I know this isn't the future you deserved. You've shown me more kindness than I could ever ask for. I only ask one thing in return. Please let her have your name. Let her grow up without the shadow of my mistakes. She deserves peace, and you are the only man I trust to give her that. I stopped breathing for a moment. My hands trembled so hard the paper rustled like dry leaves. That letter was her confession. I found myself sitting on the floor of the attic, surrounded by boxes and ghosts. My entire life, every birthday, every photograph, every memory suddenly felt like a story told in the wrong voice. I wasn't angry, not yet, just hollow. But as the hours passed, the emptiness gave way to something sharper, a kind of betrayal that burned quietly, like a slow flame. How could they have kept this from me? My mother, my father, my family, they'd all chosen silence. And yet, as I sat there, I thought about the way my father used to look at me, with such calm affection, never once treating me as anything other than his own. Maybe love had made him complicit. Maybe he believed protecting me meant pretending. Still, the lie was heavy, and it wasn't mine to carry anymore. That evening, I called Marjorie. "Do you remember anything about Mom and someone named Robert Hayes?" I asked carefully. There was a long pause on the line. Then she sighed. "Oh, Lila, you found the letters, didn't you?" My heart dropped. "So you knew?" She said softly, "Not everything, but my Aunt Evelyn, she confided in my mother once. She said she'd loved a man who never came back, that he died before he could meet his child." "His child?" I repeated, voice barely a whisper. "Yes." There was a quietness between us, the kind that only comes when truth finally settles after years of being buried. Marjorie said gently, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Your mother wasn't ashamed of you. She was protecting you from judgment, from gossip. Back then, a woman like her, she would have been ruined." I didn't respond right away. I just listened to the faint hum of the line, the ache of all the years that had passed with me living a story I never chose. That night, I stood by the window again, the locket open in my palm. The faces inside stared back at me. My mother and the man who had given me life, bound together in a secret that had slept for 60 years. I finally understood why the locket had been hidden so carefully. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a piece of truth too painful to wear, too sacred to destroy. And now it was mine to decide what to do with. I didn't go to work the next day. Instead, I sat in the kitchen with a notebook, the kind my mother used to keep grocery lists in, and I wrote down everything I'd learned. Dates, names, places, trying to make sense of the story she'd hidden so completely. There it was, on paper, the timeline of a woman's impossible choices. 1959, Evelyn meets Robert Hayes. 1963, Robert dies, I'm born. 1963, Thomas marries Evelyn, gives me his name. It looked neat and orderly, written down, but it didn't feel that way inside me. Inside, It was chaos. I kept thinking about my father, Thomas, the man who raised me, knowing I wasn't his by blood. I wanted to understand him, to know what kind of heart could love so fully in the shadow of another man. So I drove to visit my Aunt Ruth, my father's sister. She was in her late 80s now, sharp-minded, living in a care home with lilac curtains and too much sunlight. She smiled when she saw me. "Lila, oh, it's been ages. You've got your mother's eyes, you know that." I smiled faintly, but it felt strange now, knowing those eyes might have come from someone else entirely. I sat by her bed and took her hand. "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you something about Dad." She tilted her head. "Oh? What about him? Did he know that I wasn't his?" The room went so still I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Ruth's eyes softened with recognition, then sadness. "Oh, honey, he knew. He always knew." My throat tightened. "He never said anything?" "He wouldn't. Thomas was steady that way. He loved your mother long before she loved him. When she came back home, well, she wasn't the same. There was something broken in her eyes. And then she told him she was expecting. Everyone told him to walk away, but he didn't. He said love isn't a transaction." I felt tears stinging at the edges of my eyes. "So he married her to protect her?" "To protect you, dear." Ruth squeezed my hand gently. "He was your purpose, his joy. It didn't matter whose blood ran in your veins. You were his daughter." I sat there for a long time, holding her hand, the truth layering itself like sediment in my chest. Love, guilt, loyalty, all intertwined in a quiet kind of courage I hadn't known to see before. That evening, I went through my mother's things again. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for understanding. In the back of her dresser drawer, I found a small velvet box. Inside was a ring. Simple gold with a small sapphire. On the inside band, faintly engraved, were the letters RH to EM. I traced them with my fingertip, and I swear for a moment I could almost feel her there beside me. Not the mother who raised me, but the young woman she once was. Frightened, in love, standing at the edge of choices that would echo through generations. I knew I couldn't keep this story to myself anymore. It wasn't just my secret. It was our family's truth. That weekend, I called Paul again. "Can you come by the house? There's something we need to talk about." He arrived an hour later, looking wary, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "What's this about, Lila? You sound serious." "I found something," I said, motioning toward the kitchen table. The letters, the locket, the ring, all laid out like evidence in a case no one ever meant to solve. Paul's expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort almost instantly. "You're still on about that, Lila? Mom's gone. Let it rest." "I can't. Not after this." I handed him the final letter, the one that mentioned what we've created together. He read it slowly, lips tightening as he went. When he finished, he set it down and leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You think this Robert Hayes is your father?" I know he is. I found his photo, his record. He died in '63, right before I was born. He shook his head, almost laughing in disbelief. No, you're reaching. Mom and Dad... She told him. I interrupted softly. I found her letter to Thomas. She asked him to let me have his name. He agreed. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at me with a kind of wounded disbelief. So what? You want to rewrite our history? Make Dad some kind of stand-in? My voice broke when I answered. No, Paul, I just want to know the truth. That's all I've ever wanted. He stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the tile. Well, knowing won't change anything. She's gone, he's gone, all you're doing is stirring ghosts. And with that, he walked out. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a final sentence. That night, I sat in the dark living room with the locket in my hands. I thought about Paul's anger, about how truth can threaten the comfortable stories we build to survive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't anger. It was fear. He needed the world to stay simple. But I had crossed the line where simplicity was possible. A week later, I decided to do something bold. Something my mother never could. I wrote our story down. Every detail. The letters, the locket, the love that had lived and died in silence. I added photographs, documents, everything I'd found. And then I took it all to the Maple Creek Historical Society, the same people who kept records of the old base at Fort Ridley. The curator, a kind woman named Janet, read through it quietly. When she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes. This is beautiful, Lila. Painful, but beautiful. Would you be willing to share this as part of our local heritage exhibit? We're doing a section on personal stories from the Fort Ridley years. My instinct was to say no. My mother had spent her whole life hiding this story. But then I thought about what Aunt Ruth said. How love isn't a transaction. How silence can be its own kind of prison. Yes, I said finally. But not as a scandal. Tell it as what it really was. A story of love, loss, and courage. Janet nodded gently. We'll honor it that way. As I left the museum that day, I felt lighter. Not because the past was rewritten, but because it was finally seen. Still, I knew not everyone would understand. Paul didn't speak to me for weeks. Marjorie called, trying to mediate, but I told her it was fine. I'd rather live with truth and distance than comfort built on lies. In quiet moments, I found myself talking to my parents, both of them. I'd whisper, "Thank you, Mama, for loving in the face of fear. Thank you, Dad, for loving me without condition."
Word travels fast in Maple Creek. By the end of the month, everyone seemed to know about the story being added to the Fort Ridley exhibit. At first, it was just whispers, gentle curiosity. Then the details began to circulate, and curiosity turned to gossip. People who hadn't said my name in years suddenly had opinions about me, about my mother.
Some said it was romantic, others called it sad, and a few said that it was a shame she carried such a secret. I pretended not to care. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, that truth doesn't need approval. But when I overheard Mrs. Langley at the grocery store whisper, "Evelyn Cole's daughter found out her real father was one of those soldiers," something inside me wilted. It wasn't shame, it was grief that strangers could turn something sacred into small-town chatter. The exhibit opened in mid-May. I almost didn't go, but the morning of the opening, I woke early to the smell of spring rain and heard my mother's favorite song on the radio, Sinatra's "I've Got You Under Your Skin." That was all the sign I needed. I drove to the community center where the museum had set up a temporary gallery. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax. Families wandered the aisles, reading plaques, pointing at photographs of soldiers and letters from loved ones long gone. And there, in the far corner, was the small display with my mother's name. The plaque read, "Evelyn M. Cole and Lieutenant Robert Hayes, A Love and Letters, 1959 to 1963. Inside the glass case sat the locket, the sapphire ring, and one of the letters, the gentlest one, chosen by Janet for its tenderness rather than its sorrow. My dearest Evelyn, the uniform may own my body, but my heart is already yours." I stood there for a long while, reading that line over and over until my reflection blurred in the glass. Then I felt someone step beside me. Paul. He looked older somehow, tired, guarded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You really did it." I said, "Yes." He sighed, looking at the display. "People are talking, you know?" "I know." "They're saying Mom lied." "She did," I said gently, "but she also survived. That's what they don't see." Paul folded his arms, still staring at the locket. Finally, he said, "I was angry. I thought you were trying to destroy her memory. But standing here, I get it now. You're honoring her, aren't you?" I felt my throat tighten. She spent her life protecting a truth that cost her everything. The least I can do is let her be seen for who she was, not just who she pretended to be. Paul nodded slowly. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. It was our mother holding me as a baby, smiling in the garden. He said, "I found this in Dad's things. Look on the back." I turned it over. In my father's careful handwriting were the words, "For my girls, always." I pressed my lips together, fighting the tears. I whispered, "He really did love her." Paul nodded. "And you." We stood there a long time, side by side, watching strangers walk past the story that had once been our family's secret. For the first time, there was no shame between us, just quiet understanding. Over the following weeks, the exhibit drew more attention than anyone expected. Local papers wrote about it, calling it a love hidden by history. Veterans' families came forward with their own stories, letters, and mementos. The museum started a new section called Echoes of Home, dedicated to personal legacies from that era. One afternoon, Janet called me. She said, "You should know, a woman named Ellen Hayes visited today. She's Robert's niece." I froze. She said she never knew much about her uncle, only that the family rarely spoke of him after the accident, but she wanted to thank you for giving him a name again. I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, silent tears sliding down my face. All those years, I'd thought uncovering the truth would destroy something, but instead it had built a bridge across decades of silence, connecting two families who didn't even know they were bound. A month later, I met Ellen in person.
She was about my age, with kind eyes and the same gentle manner my mother used to have. We met at the museum, standing in front of the display that had brought us together. She said softly, "I can't believe how much he looks like you." She pointed to a photograph of Robert Hayes in uniform. I smiled faintly. I never got to meet him, but somehow, I feel like I've known him my whole life. She reached into her bag and handed me a small framed photo. This was his family's. I think you should have it. It's his graduation picture. I took it with shaking hands. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same smile that had stared back at me from the mirror all my life. We stood there in silence, two women linked by a story neither of us had written, but both had inherited. When we parted, she hugged me. She said, "You gave him back to us, and to yourself." Back home, I placed that photograph on the mantle, beside one of my mother and my father. 3 lives, 3 truths, all part of one whole. For the first time, I didn't feel torn between them. I felt complete. And when the town's gossip eventually faded, as gossip always does, what remained wasn't scandal. It was legacy. People began to speak of my mother not as the woman who lied, but as the woman who loved bravely in silence. And in a way, that's the truth I'd been chasing all along. In the evenings, I'd still make chamomile tea and sit by the window, just like she used to, only now I'd wear the locket. I'd open it sometimes and whisper, "I know now, Mama, and I forgive you." The air in the house felt lighter after that, like even the walls had exhaled after 60 years of holding their breath. And I'd sit there, watching the sun sink behind the pines, feeling not loss, but belonging.
Summer rolled in quietly that year, soft, warm, and generous. The kind of summer my mother used to love. Every morning, the smell of honeysuckle drifted through the kitchen window, and for the first time since her passing, the house didn't feel haunted by silence. It felt lived in again. After the exhibit, people in town began to treat me differently, not out of pity, but with a sort of gentle respect. I'd walk through the farmer's market and someone would say, "Your mama's story. That took courage to share." And I'd smile, because that was the word that had finally replaced secret. Courage. Paul eventually came around. One evening, he stopped by unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and a pie he'd picked up from the diner. "Peace offering," he said, standing awkwardly at the door. I laughed and waved him in. "You're lucky I still like pie." We ate in the kitchen, like we used to when we were kids. He didn't say much at first, just looked around, noticing the new photo on the mantle, Robert Hayes in his uniform placed right beside our parents. After a while, he said quietly, "You were right. It's better this way." "I didn't want to hurt anyone," I told him. "I know." He looked down at his glass. "You made me realize something. Mom and Dad didn't live a lie. They lived with love. Just a complicated kind of it." That word, complicated, carried so much truth, because love, in its purest form, rarely fits into simple shapes. We talked for hours that night, laughing, remembering things we hadn't thought about in years. For the first time since the discovery, the house was filled with warmth again, the kind that seeps in quietly like light finding its way through old curtains. A few weeks later, I drove out to Fort Ridley again. The old base looked peaceful now, grass growing over the cracks in the pavement, the air humming with cicadas. The museum was quiet. Summer crowds had thinned. I walked to the memorial wall, where Robert Hayes' name was etched in bronze. My fingers traced the letters slowly. "I found you," I whispered, "and I think Mama's finally at peace now."
The wind stirred through the trees, and for a moment, I swear I could smell lavender. It wasn't a sign, not in any mystical sense, just memory, carrying on air. But it was enough. I took a photo of the memorial and framed it beside my mother's locket when I got home. It felt right, placing their stories side by side. Two people who had loved deeply and imperfectly, bound by loss and the life they created. Me. That night I wrote a letter, not to anyone living, but to the two people who had given me everything without ever standing in the same room together. Dear Mama and Robert, I used to think your secret took something from me, a truth, a name, a piece of certainty. But now I see it gave me something else entirely. It gave me the understanding that love isn't always fair or simple. Sometimes it's quiet, sacrificial, hidden. But that doesn't make it less real. Mama, you taught me strength through silence. Robert, you gave me life, and in some way, the courage to seek truth. I hope wherever you both are, you know I carry you with grace, not shame. Your daughter, Lila. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the locket behind the photographs. It felt like closing a circle that had been open for 60 years. In the months that followed, I began to write more, not just about my family, but about the hidden stories that live quietly in so many homes. Stories tucked in boxes, sealed in letters, buried under fear and duty. The local paper even asked if I'd contribute a column about personal histories and legacies. I called it The Things We Keep. Every week, people would write in with their own stories, long-lost loves, secrets carried through generations, truths found too late but treasured nonetheless. And every time I read them, I thought of my mother, of the chest she'd hidden away, waiting for the right hands to open it. Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the things we leave behind, but the courage it takes for someone else to face them. One evening, near the end of the summer, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, painting the sky in soft gold. The air smelled like rain and pine. I could hear kids laughing down the street, neighbors calling to one another, life moving on. And in that quiet space between day and dusk, I felt her with me. My mother's presence, gentle as always. I understand now, I whispered. You weren't hiding from me, you were protecting me. The wind rustled the trees and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I realized then that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just the quiet knowing that you can finally love the people who hurt you, not because they were right, but because you understand why they did what they did. These days, when visitors ask about the exhibit, I tell them the truth, that it's not a story about secrets or shame. It's a story about a woman who loved too deeply for her time, a man who gave love without condition, and a daughter who finally learned that truth and love can coexist, even when they don't look perfect. And sometimes, when I see couples lingering by that glass case, reading those letters, I smile, because somewhere in those words, my mother's heart still beats. When autumn came, I decided to close the old family home for good. Not to sell it, but to preserve it as it was, a quiet place for memory. I left the chest where I found it, now filled with copies of the letters, my own notes, and a small card that read, "Some stories aren't lost, they're just waiting to be found." I locked the door gently behind me, slipped the locket around my neck, and walked down the porch steps without looking back, because I didn't need to anymore. I was finally free, not from my family's past, but from the fear of it.